One of the few enjoyable or most enjoyable things that academics get to do is to look around the field and find those people who are destined to take over our jobs. As the members of the Freeman Award Committee, we went through and decided to have a look at who were the brightest, youngest stars in social network analysis. And it turns out this is really hard because there are a lot of really, really good people. And so as we were reading this work, we stumbled across Arnout's work. And what was remarkable about this work is not just its volume. He has over 25 publications ranging from the American Journal of Sociology multiple times, Social Networks multiple times, Rationality and Society multiple times, but also just the sheer quality of the work. Numerous times, those of us in the committee thought, man, I wish I had written that, right? Or, you know, I was going to write something like that, but I never would have gotten to it nearly as well or nearly as nice. And so at this point, we thought, well, what do we do, right? Clearly this is good work. This is work that is deserving of an award, but none of us can pronounce his name. And so it's not at all clear that if we gave him an award, we'd have to stand up here and try to come up with that. But I drew the shortest straw, and so without further ado, in the way of which really the truly remarkable work, and we welcome you to the group of other Freeman Award winners. Arnout, congratulations, and we look forward to hearing what you say.
Thank you, Jim, for these wonderful words. This is a very kind introduction. It's a true honor to stand here in front of you, in the footsteps of such giants as Jim Moody himself, Gary Robbins, and Carter Butts. And I would also like to immediately thank the organizing committee of Sunbelt for making this possible, this opportunity to share some of my work with you today. So throughout the talk, through this lecture, I'm going to emphasize and underscore the importance not of theory, which is also very important, and data, but of the connections between theory and data, the derivations, as I will call them. And whether they be formal theorems or agent-based models or hypotheses or just hunches based on, inspired by a theory. In each case, they serve to illuminate how the theory relates to the data, to connect a theory that is in need of data for validation and verification, and data that is in need of explanation of the patterns in it. And really, so they are the pathways by which scientific inquiry flows. And the more of these connections exist in a network of science, the more ability there is for data sets to be understood and theories to create understanding. Now, you may be more familiar, perhaps, with an alternative representation of the scientific inquiry, which is this big wheel of science within the north, the theory, in the south, the data. You see where the west is. That will be over here for you. The deduction, and in the right, the induction. And then the wheel goes clockwise, which is counterclockwise for me. And that wheel keeps spinning over and over again. I was hoping that maybe my alternative metaphor of network would, count on some support in this particular group. And so there's three particular things of derivations, three things of derivations that they can do that I would like to emphasize throughout the talk. And the first is simply to assess what confirms and what falsifies a theory. And the theories it's not immediately always apparent whether a theory would predict one thing or another thing. For example, network theories oftentimes are cast in terms of isolated individuals, dyads, and triads, for which a certain property is assumed to hold. But then the individuals, dyads, and triads that come from the real world, they are embedded in larger network structures. And so it is not completely clear how those assumptions that are made about the isolated individuals, dyads, and triads play out in these larger structures. And the connection needs to be made between the theory and the data in order to know that. And I'm going to illustrate this phenomenon, this particular function of derivation, with two projects that I've worked on: the theory of structural wholes with Vincent Buskins, and the derivations from the theory of structural balance. Second thing that derivations can do, also very important, is expand the explanatory scope through the application to other contexts. The more arrows there exist in the network, the better. The more opportunities there are for yet unaccounted for patterns in empirical data to be accounted for, to be explained by theories. And Classic theories really can be recycled to explain many puzzling findings in new contexts, and I also want to illustrate that in the second part of the talk with two theories on which I've done derivational work, which is the theory of small worlds. My work was done with my collaborators Xiaomen Bang and Ji Gao, and the theory of homophily, which I applied to immigrant assimilation. And then I conclude the talk by looking at the future, and in particular the opportunities that new data from the information age, the digital age, whatever you wish to call it, allow for. And in particular, I think this is variation across systems and context. In sociology, my home discipline, we've always wanted to explain systems, but then we only had one data set available at a time. And so what happens, we ended up testing theories about individuals when really we wanted to talk about systems. But now with this information revolution, we can look at many different networks at a time, study their properties, and really develop theories and derive the hypotheses about what makes one system different from another. I think some very exciting developments are currently occurring, and I would like to highlight some of them, and I think there's a lot to be expected from them. So the first thing that derivations can do is assessing what confirms or falsify a theory, and the first illustration will be with the theory of structural holes. So the theory of structural holes really consists of two steps. There is a step that translates a positional advantage into a resource advantage, and a positional advantage really is a position in a network that an individual can occupy that is more advantageous than some other position. And in the theory of structural holes, this is a situation in which one brokers the information flow between otherwise disconnected others. And this positional advantage, structural advantage in the network, creates a resource advantage. This translates into higher salaries, job promotions, better ideas, knowing earlier about something because the information that you have access to is to many more pockets in the network. And that relationship in different contexts between positional advantage and resource advantages has been demonstrated repeatedly, has been evidenced repeatedly in a wide variety of contexts. But here in this example, we focus on the preceding step, namely that strategic networking can make positional advantages emerge. It can give rise to positional advantages. And this is how that works. So the positional advantage here is illustrated. This is taken from Ron Burt's on structural holes. A positional advantage is taken by Robert over James. James is connected to individuals who already have connections to one another, whereas Robert is situated in the networks in such a way that if the connections that he has were cut off, then the cluster there in C, I will point to this part, this part, C of the network would be cut off of the rest. And clearly Robert is in a very important position in the network, and information reaches him from different corners. And that positional advantage, so goes the theory, can be obtained through strategic networking. So what we see here is a before network. The focal actor has 5 connections, and here they are largely redundant in the sense that they lead to the same cluster of the network. And then we see an after network obtained through strategic networking by rewiring, taking out some existing ties and adding some new relations, and that really leads to a situation in which 5 different parts of the networks are being bridged and putting the focal actor really in a very powerful and resource-rich position. So the starting point of the analysis here is that in this classic analysis, the focal actor is strategic, but all the other actors are passive and cooperative. And so we simply asked the question, Vincent Baskin's I, is this asymmetry necessary for the argument? What if others are also strategic? What if we have a priori homogeneity across these actors? Is a positional advantage then sustainable? Can we explain its emergence? So the study strategy is very simple. We maintain the same analysis. The only thing we change is the heterogeneity in the willingness and the ability of agents to engage in strategic networking and adding bridge ties and removing redundant ties from the network. So we situate a homogeneous population in some arbitrary initial network. We let the agents all rewire their local networks, optimizing on structural holes, and then we see if differentiation in social capital occurs. If some actors end up with positional advantages and others with positional disadvantages. So the model has n actors. We prove analytical results for any number of actors, and we have simulation results for small numbers of actors. They are randomly selected one by one, and they are given the opportunity to change one or more links in the network. And they do so following utility maximization in a myopic way, in a way that many of you will be familiar with. They compare the network that is immediately obtained after the reconfiguration that they're considering implementing with the one that they are currently in, and then they see if that leads to an improvement in their position. And then they occasionally make a mistake, or an alternative interpretation is they occasionally follow incentives that are orthogonal to the utility function here. Now, because all the actors are strategic and not just one, the addition of a link requires consent. And then we simply proceed until equilibrium is reached. The measure of social capital that we employ, the utility function, needs to set aside one important property, and that is that a tie should only be added, should only be valuable if it is sufficiently a bridge tie and not too redundant. And so there is a measure of constraint proposed by Bird that satisfies exactly that property, as can be seen in this formula. So in the denominator, we see the degree of an individual, which decreases the constraint of an actor. So the more ties you have, the lower your constraint. And since utility decreases in constraint, the higher your utility. Unless the tie that is being added creates so much redundancy that in the enumerator, a lot of mutual contacts of I and j appear that offset this effect on the constraint function. So we have a utility function that satisfies this property. If the utility increases, bridge ties are being added. If the utility decreases, redundant ties are being added. And the equilibrium notion we use in the model is the one that naturally appears, which is because we have actors add ties only if they're valuable, and if they can count on consent by the other actor involved. We end up with a notion of pairwise stability in which no actor can profitably delete or a tie, or with consent add a tie. Now, because this is somewhat a weak stability notion, because only one tie change at a time is being considered, what we did in this study is also focus on a refinement of the stability notion of unilateral stability, where no actor can profitably or with consent reconfigure her ego network. So now we consider entire ego network reconfigurations at a time. And if no actor in the network can make such a reconfiguration that can count on consent and is utility improving, improves one's positional advantage, then we consider this stable. So with these stability notions in hand, we proceed. And the first result that I would like to present to you is that in virtually all these runs of the simulation model, variance in the utility goes to 0. So even though initially when we would position the homogeneous population in a random network, there might still have, some individuals may have had certain positional advantages over others, but as they engage in strategic networking, what ends up happening is that all these positional advantages disappear, and this is visible in these equilibrium networks that we show exist for any network size, but also frequently appear in our simulations. We see that the individuals in the long run end up taking positions that are structurally regularly equivalent to one another and are of similar strategic advantage. And these results have been found to be somewhat robust in other models of strategic networking in which similar incentives were provided to actors and similar stability notions were used. And so we reached the conclusion, really, that without a priori heterogeneity of some type, unless the actors are already different from one another, it is impossible to obtain positional differentiation. And so the resource advantages that one would like to address to positional advantages, the resource advantages the theory of structural wholes is attempting to explain, can only be explained in terms of positional advantages if these positional advantages themselves come from some kind of ability or willingness or resource differences across actors that existed before these positional advantages existed. And so there are some possibilities for what that could be. For example, Bird himself suggests the existence of a greater structural entrepreneurship among some people. Some people might be more inclined to engage in this kind of activity, be highly strategic, whereas other individuals may be largely unaware of the possibilities for strategic networking that exist in a network. And that is a perfectly reasonable explanation. Another possibility is that it's, in fact, resource advantages themselves that go prior to positional advantage that really explain where those positional advantages came from, a greater ability of some actors because of more power, because of more initial resources, to manipulate network structure, to create positional advantages that then ultimately lead back to resource advantages. And here the task at hand is to figure out if this evidence that has been collected over the years is really evidencing this first step between resource advantage and positional advantage, or the latter step between the positional advantage and resource advantage. Or perhaps a possibility that what was really involved here is some kind of reinforcement effect where random differences in positional advantages or resource advantages can feed back into one another and create a self-sustaining hierarchy of resources. So, and empirical directions that this suggests is the identification of one exact antecedent that the current derivation that we're focusing on suggests exists before, causally before positional advantage and resource advantages. And to evidence that, in fact, the link between positional advantage and resource advantage that we see goes in the direction that is presumed by the theory. So it is in this way that deriving the result that positional differentiation seems to require some kind of a priori heterogeneity, that we get a better grip on what kinds of empirical data support the theory and what kinds of empirical data do not provide support for the theory. A second illustration comes from work that I've done on the theory of structural balance. And here we work with the 4 aphorisms that many of you will be comfortable with and aware of. The friend of a friend is a friend. The friend of an enemy is an enemy. The enemy of a friend is an enemy. And the enemy of an enemy is a friend. And these aphorisms can be represented as 4 triads where a solid line represents a friendly link and a dashed line an inimical relationship. 2 of those 4 triads are balanced. 2 of them are imbalanced. The first one is balanced because it satisfies all 4 aphorisms, and so is the third, where 2 friends have a mutual enemy. But the second and the fourth are imbalanced because they violate several of the aphorisms. For example, the last one violates aphorism number 4, that the enemy of an enemy be a friend. Now, it's important to note that there exists more richer formulations of these of the principle of structural balance and balance theory in general that involve directed ties and reflexive ties. And important work has been done, but here I focus on the most elementary, rudimentary form of the theory. And the evidence for this theory comes from at least 2 sources. Ethnographic studies, they have found that hooligans and urban youth, they seem to follow this kind of heuristic when they interact with one another. And this is called Bedouin syndrome in these scenarios. And as they follow these aphorisms, these seeming behavioral guidelines, they spontaneously form blocks of associations and their self-emergent conflict along party lines. Another type of evidence comes from network snapshots, sociometric studies or longitudinal studies where we have a snapshot of a network and we can count triads in those networks. So we can decompose the network into triads and then count how many different triads of which different types exist in a network. And if the theory were correct, or at least approximated the data, then what we would have to see, so goes the argument, is that the balanced triads occur more frequently than average, and that the imbalanced triads occur less frequently than average. And although from context to context the results differ somewhat, what we find typically is that all of the triads occur with the expected frequency. The first one, friend of a friend is a friend, above average frequency. The second one, where there's one inimical relation among 2 friendly ties, occurs very, very infrequently in many contexts. The mutual enemy situation, the third triad, occurs frequently. But the last triad, the enemy of an enemy being an enemy, occurs often of average frequency or above average frequency, and so that violates the theory of structural balance. And the classic reconciliation of this evidence is to say, well, Let's drop the fourth requirement. Let's just say that the enemy of an enemy can be either a friend or an enemy. And then this weaker version of the theory thereby reconciles the theory with the empirical evidence. And so the story seems complete. That was until recently some physicists discovered or rediscovered jammed states, which is networks in which many imbalanced triads exist. But the remarkable thing is that no individual in the network can do anything about it. No tie can be changed from negative to positive, from friendly to inimical, or inimical to friendly, without making the situation even worse, without creating even more structural imbalance in the network. And so in this sense, this network satisfies the principle of structural balance not at the triadic level, but at the system level. And moreover, it turns out that these jammed states, they exist all the way up to the half point, whereby half of the ties are imbalanced and half of the triads, are balanced. And moreover, on top of that, if we consider all equilibrium states, all network stat, in which no actor can improve any triad in terms of balance that is adjacent to that actor, the number of such equilibrium networks that exists that is jammed is about 99%, and vastly outnumbers balanced states. So the prevalence of imbalanced triads of the negative type in these networks is really not a problem from this perspective, because the principle of structural balance can be satisfied in an embedded setting in which these triads, the imbalanced triads, are co-occurring with the balanced triads, and the change of one relation changes balance in multiple adjacent triads, and therefore prevent the principle of structural balance to be satisfied at the triad level. And so if these were the equilibrium networks that we would predict in real life, then it would be perfectly possible to see in triad counts many imbalanced triads occur. So hence the importance of theoretical derivation to see how the satisfaction of principal balance, of the principle of structural balance at the triad level translates to their satisfaction at the system level. Moreover, generalized balance can also jam. So even the solution where we drop the fourth requirement, even for that solution, for that alternative notion of balance, we can find networks in which it is violated in many triads. In this network that is shown here, it is possible to change any tie that you change. It will worsen the situation, and even more imbalanced triads will be introduced on that for any actor who changes a tie. So really that means that no triad type, since we have now also found equilibrium configurations with the other imbalanced triad over here, really no triad type is empirically precluded. And so can we really take evidence from embedded settings in which these imbalanced triads exist in larger networks as evidence against the theory? And this equilibrium analysis seems to suggest no. They have no falsificational value. So the starting point of my analysis is to say, well, how stable are these jammed states really? So the jammed state account for the discrepancy between the evidence and the theory is really heavily depends on the relative stability of these jammed states. How easily do they occur in everyday life to balanced states? And a stability assessment requires an explicit model of sign change on a balanced network, on a fixed network. And several models of balanced dynamics have been proposed in the past, but they prevent jamming from occurring because of one of two reasons. Either the network is fixed, is not fixed, so actors can eliminate ties and they can trivially resolve any imbalances in the network. Or actors can hold ambivalent evaluations of others and simply add a friendly tie on top of an inimical relationship, or they can add an inimical relationship on a friendly relationship and be both friends and enemies with the same person, in which case all four requirements of structural balance are automatically satisfied. But there exists context for jamming in which institutional or spatial constraints prevent actors from from walking off. They repeatedly will run into one another, and these situations are typically characterized by forces that force these actors to commit, to say, this is where my loyalties are. These are my friends, these are my enemies. You're either with us or against us. And these are situations where people come together in institutional constrained areas, or spatially constrained areas, such as classrooms, work floors, fraternities, sororities, gangs in the neighborhood, spatially concentrated, bands of hooligans, and sovereign states who cannot choose what other states they are bordering. So to analyze jamming in these settings, these important settings to which this principle of structural balance has been repeatedly applied, we look at a model in which we have a fixed network of n actors, so they can now not change the network structure, but on top of the network structure lies the sentiment, the friendships and the inimical relationships, and actors are chosen one by one in this model to change one of these relationships. They can either befriend a former enemy, or they can turn a previously friendly relation into an inimical one and freeze it. And so we consider two regimes, one in which an actor changes one or tie, or a regime in which an actor changes up to the number of ties that exist in the network. Again, they maximize a utility function in a myopic way, comparing the status quo with any network that is obtainable through a reconfiguration of sentiment changes in their ego network, and by maximizing that utility, which is a positive function of the number of balanced triads involving the actor, we get a stepwise process, and at some point, some equilibrium is presumably reached, and we're interested in whether that equilibrium is perfectly balanced, or whether we will frequently find these jammed states back here in these simulations. So the first result is really that these jammed states are a lot less stable than the balanced states. Namely, the following happens. If we allow an actor to change more than one tie at a time, then these jammed states resolve, they collapse. And this comes from the fact that any actor, it turns out, can reconfigure his ties in such a way that he copies the relationship of another actor. And there's always at least one actor who can do that in such a way that this reduces the balance in the relationships adjacent to him or her. And so there will always be, from any initial network, some actor who can improve his or her local situation until ultimately a balanced network is obtained. And this holds for complete networks under both a structural and a generalized balance regime, as it turns out. A second reason for why jammed states are less stable than balanced states is that when actors occasionally act in an orthogonal way, not according to the utilities function, but make an error, so to speak, then these perturbations of the jammed states, they lead away, the dynamics lead away towards the balanced states, and in the long run, the behavior of the system ends up near a balanced state. And this holds for any fixed network, any topology, any number of simultaneous sign changes, and it holds for both structural and generalized balance. And the robustness of these findings were recently corroborated by a study in PNAS by Marvel, Kleinberg, and Strogatz, who find a similar tendency for balance to always be obtained in a continuous time, continuous sentiment model. So the work we've really done with the derivation now is to establish that these triad counts really do have falsificational value after all. Why? Because the balanced states are much more stable than the jammed states, we can expect those to occur in everyday life, and so any balanced triad in these more balanced networks, we can expect to be either of the first or the third type, being three friends, or two friends who have a mutual enemy, and none of the two other triads. So now we turn to the second type of thing that derivations can do, and that is expand the scope of theories beyond where they have previously been applied, by drawing new connections, by drawing new derivations. And they can be used to account for previously unaccounted for phenomena, and to make new predictions in those areas. I'll first illustrate this for the theory of small worlds. In these experiments on small worlds, we're all familiar with, an individual is given a package, the package contains a letter. The letter is intended for someone that individual doesn't know. The letter contains some social demographic information on that target recipient, and the individual is asked to forward it to one of his or her friends or acquaintances who might know this target individual. The letter is then passed on to that individual, and the same individual will be asked again to forward the letter until perhaps the letter is discarded or the letter arrives at the intended individual. And those experiments from the 60s showed that these letters reach the target recipients surprisingly often, given how easy it is to stop this process with just one individual who's uncooperative. In the most famous instantiation, I think it was about 25% of the letters that did arrive, and with a median number of hops, forwarding chain of about 5 or 6. And so this really revealed that acquaintance networks have short paths, but what it also revealed is that these short paths that individuals are on, and were found to be on, that these individuals there, they were capable of finding them without having any knowledge of the network at all, apart from their very local experience. So they only knew their acquaintances and not the acquaintance of their acquaintances, not the acquaintance of their acquaintances. And yet, they were able to direct the message in the right direction and for these messages to arrive very speedily. And the theory that was used to explain that was to say, well, what happens is that individuals live in acquaintance networks, and these have homophilous characteristics, and they're geographically embedded. So when the letter has to go to someone in Germany, then maybe your friend in Berlin should be contacted. Or if the letter has to go to a lawyer, then your lawyer friend perhaps should be contacted to see if he knows the target individual. And so this homophilous or geographical embedding of the network provided the coordinates for this navigation. That is how the Milgram experiment, the second aspect of the Milgram experiment, is explained. And after that, many studies have found in both synthetic networks, model networks, as well as real-world networks that were pre-embedded. Say we have a snapshot of a network with also the attribute information. We know that there's homophily in the network, and we redo the Milgram experiment in a synthetic way on this network, having the nodes forward the message to the node that is most similar to the target individual or geographically most proximate to the target individual. And these re-simulations, these repeated simulations of the Milgram experiment, they have been reasonably successful for different types of networks, depending on which was studied. But what we are interested in is the possibility that this decentralized navigation, the idea that nodes can find one another even when they are beyond one's immediate experience, that this might be a more general property of a lot of real-world networks, even the ones where no such embedding that presumably was needed for the individuals to know where in what direction to pass on the message is present. Also, non-social networks that are not geographically embedded or that don't exhibit homophily. Namely, if we can somehow have the nodes take on a coordinate that is a fictive social identity, if you will, in a way that is distributed without an external individual coming in and saying, you have coordinate X and you have coordinate Y, and you always route it to him if you want to get to her. But in a way that the nodes themselves can embed themselves, and so that a network can always self-organize to create and find the paths from a source to a target node. And so the study strategy that we took was to take diverse real-world networks. We have the nodes embed themselves in a low-dimensional latent space. We simulate the small world experiment in the individuals in the network. They forward the message to the acquaintance that is most similar to the target node based on this embedding that we have arrived at. And then we simply see if the packages arrive and in how many steps. And we use two embedding methods. These are these self-embedding methods. LMDS, which is landmark-based multidimensional scaling. And multidimensional scaling, of course, does not really qualify as a method because it requires the shortest path matrix, which is really cumbersome and hard to come by in a decentralized fashion. But what you can have is some pre-embedded small fraction of nodes that we will call landmarks they have coordinates, and then all the remaining nodes in the network embed themselves with respect to these landmarks in a distributed way, so that they can do this without any central coordinating device. And the running time and the memory requirements for this, they are linear, they are scalable. And so for hyperbolic embedding, which was proposed by Kleinberg, we have similar characteristics. The embedding is also distributed. The nodes themselves can learn through communication with their immediate other nodes, with their adjacent nodes, what their coordinates should be. And again, we have a running time that is linear network size, and memory that is polylogarithmic in network size. And with these embedding methods in hand, we repeat these small world experiments. And these are the 5 real-world networks that we use to see if this seems to be some kind of general property of networks, that they can be navigated in an embedded way without the existence of any pre-embedded coordinates. So the first is an astrophysics co-authorship network. The nodes, of course, are the authors, and the edges are the co-authorships. The internet backbone consisting of autonomous systems that are connected with one another. A peer-to-peer file sharing network of computers. Movie actor collaborations, where the movie actors are the nodes and the collaborations are the edges. And New York Times juxtapositions. This is a new data set that we collected from the New York Times, where names that frequently occur in the news, celebrities, when they co-occur with other frequently occurring names in the news in the same article, we say that a link exists. These are very different size and different topological properties, but what these 5 networks share in common is that they have the small world property, that there's an average path length that is very low. So these are networks from diverse contexts and topologies, but they all have the small world property. So we know that there are short paths, but the question is, can we find them? Can these nodes find them themselves? And here are the navigation results. What you see is the 2 embedding methods that I discussed before, landmark-based multidimensional scaling and hyperbolic method in 2 of the columns, and also shown is a degree-based routing method. And this degree-based routing method doesn't use any coordinates in the network. It simply forwards the package to the any individual that the focal node is related to, who has more friends, and that individual to even more friends, and then hopefully it will arrive at an individual with so many connections that he knows the target individual. Now that method that doesn't use any coordinates doesn't have much success, and if it has success, the packages arrive in a large number of hops. But the embedding methods that we use, they really have great success. In a majority of cases, the packages arrive, and it happens in, if you compare this with the average path length, in a number of hops that really minimizes the detour that is being taken. And for the hyperbolic method, the second method that we used, where it's been shown that success is guaranteed, but we don't know how long the detour is going to be, we find that in 5 cases, the detour is very small and also can be counted on 2 hands. And so we have a guaranteed delivery in an average of 6 hops. So the classic ladder forwarding method induced from small world experiments, it seems to be a general solution for network navigation, and embedded forwarding, the ability to navigate a network, to get from anywhere in a network to somewhere else in a decentralized fashion, seems to be a property that holds for a lot of the first real-world networks, social and non-social. And so here we have an example of how a theory that was used to explain behavior in one context was reapplied to make predictions in other contexts, and these predictions were found to hold. And so here's another example, based on the theory of homophily, of such derivations, of such new connections that are made between theories and data sets that they weren't applied to before. And here we are applying it to immigrant assimilation, and there is a classic thesis in immigrant assimilation that is age-old, and that scholars in the field of immigration debate over and over again, and that is whether immigrant assimilation is reversible, whether it is progressive and has to happen, or whether immigrants can move in the other direction. And this was proposed by Park a long time ago and recurs in current work frequently. And the evidence on this is really mixed, because the types of data collection methods to evidences, they're limited, because ethnographic studies, they can't really generalize. These studies find that many immigrants don't in fact assimilate over the course of their lives. And the cross-sectional studies, which also find that there is no average assimilation in many domains. These studies, the cross-sectional surveys, they are not longitudinal, so we cannot compare an immigrant who is 2 years in the country with an immigrant who has been 10 years in the country, because they're very different immigrants, and we would like to compare apples with apples. And so here we present data from a unique study, a longitudinal survey of immigrants to Canada, where immigrants were followed over the course of 4 years. It's representative of some target population. Immigrants aged 15 plus landed from abroad legally in 2001 and still present in 2005. And it is longitudinal. We have the immigrants being interviewed half year after entry, 2 years after entry, and 4 years after entry. And when we look at this data, what we find is there is, in fact, a good reason to believe that immigrant assimilation is reversible in 6 domains that you see here in the rows: friendship, colleagues, household, language, identity, values, all ways that an immigrant can assimilate. For example, in terms of friendship, they can initiate friendships with the mainstream and cut ties with their own immigrant group. The same they can do for colleagues and household. For language skills, they can improve their language skills and increase their use of the language skills of the host country. Their identity can change. They can feel more a member of the society that they are now living in. And in terms of values, they can decide to stop carrying on or to reduce the importance of the values from their homeland or from their ethnic group in their everyday lives. And skilled in this way, all between the ethnic group and the mainstream, what we find is that large numbers of immigrants show from one wave to another a reverse movement where they increase the number of friends that are of the same ethnic group. They increase the number of colleagues. They move into ethnic economies. Many even see that their language skills deteriorate. Their identities strengthen, their ethnic identities, and increasing the importance, how important they find it to carry on the values of their homeland. And in 2 cases, for identity and values, we even find that an average immigrant is reverse assimilating. So this really throws everything upside down, and the classic thesis is really off the table here in this data, and this raises the question: what can explain this? Now we could resort to a new theory, but in this case I believe that an old theory could be dusted up and made to apply in this case. Because the theory of homophily is about network ties and attributes, and that's what immigrant assimilation is about after all as well. These friendships, these work relations, and these household relations, those are all network ties, and language, identity, and values can be treated as attributes of the nodes. And so homophily, which of course occurs when the network ties are matched up with the attributes, where one is connected to individuals who share the same language, identity, and value. Those homophilous states, when one reflects on this, they occur in 2 extreme situations. One is where the immigrant is locked up in the ethnic enclave and has only friendship and colleague ties and residential ties with the immigrants who also live in that community. And the other extreme, where also homophily occurs, is when they are assimilated themselves, their values, identity, language has changed, and they are now living and working and being friends among the members of the mainstream. And anywhere in between, there is less homophily, because then we have relationships that go to people who hold very different identities, values, and speak a different language. So homophily occurs at the extremes, and so if we imagine the assimilation process as occurring along one dimension, within the one extreme, the ethnic group, and the other extreme, the mainstream culture, then a tendency towards greater homophily would really lead to a bidirectional movement, where immigrants who are situated close to the ethnic group maybe have a little bit of language skills, maybe have a few friends among the mainstream population. They will have a pressure towards homophily that leads back into the immigrant community, whereas those who have made significant strides towards the mainstream, they're in a position in which homophily is obtained by further assimilating. And so this provides an account for how we could find reverse movement among immigrants in this longitudinal study. And it also provides us with two hypotheses that can be additionally derived. And one of those is that the directionality depends on the position, so assimilation is self-reinforcing. Immigrants who are already quite assimilated will assimilate further, and immigrants who are not so assimilated will retreat back into the immigrant community. And the second hypothesis is that if we would take a snapshot of the immigration process at any time, which is what this data set did, half a year after entry, 2 years after entry, and 4 years after entry, what we would have to see is that immigrants are located near the poles of this distribution, near the two situations that are homophilous and not in the heterophilous situations that halfway represents. And so an immigrant population will internally polarize at any moment that we observe them during the assimilation process. So evidence for both of these hypotheses can come from the same data source. First, we check if assimilation in one domain of assimilation increases if there are greater levels of assimilation in other domains. So for example, if one has a lot of friends among the mainstream, does the tendency to then also develop language skills, values, identity, associated with the mainstream, is there a greater tendency for that to happen, or is there a lesser tendency to happen? So green represents positive reinforcement effects, where more assimilation leads to even more assimilation. Gray is no effect, and red is a negative effect, and we see that in fact no negative effects occur that are significant, and in various cases there are positive reinforcement effects. So this provides some support for the idea that assimilation is in fact a self-reinforcing process. The second hypothesis we can also find evidence for in the data. So what we can look is we can at any point in time look at an assimilation variable and say, okay, you're above the median or below the median. If we didn't dichotomize, things would become really intractable. And then we could do this for all 6 domains and say, okay, in how many dimensions are you assimilated at any point in time? And we could do this for all immigrants and then count how many immigrants are, for example, assimilated in 0 domains, which occurs here on the left. In the dark gray bars measures the propensity. And we can count how many individuals are assimilated in all domains. And what we find is that there are large frequencies near the extreme as predicted by the theory, and there are low frequencies in the middle. We can also ask if those who find themselves in those homophilous situations, being either fully assimilated or not assimilated at all, are more likely to stay there than if they are in an in-between situation, and that also turns out to be the case when we look here at the stability figures. So we conclude that the theory homophily appears to be successfully applicable in this area, and explain a pattern that was unaccounted for by prior theory in this area of immigrant assimilation. It can also generate 2 new predictions, for which also some initial evidence was found. Interesting to note here is that these findings seem to pose a problem for the policies of integration without acculturation, because the theory of homophily seems to suggest that if acculturation leads to integration, integration leads to acculturation. So it would be hard for countries in Western Europe and also in Canada that strive to have immigrants participate in the everyday life with the mainstream, but at the same time not lose their identity and values. That would be a difficult situation to accomplish. So I would like to conclude the talk by looking to the future. And the third thing that I believe derivations can do is to explain variation across contexts. And there's two ways that the information age, the digital age, I believe, 2 new opportunities that the information age provides for finding ways by which context phenomena vary from context to context. And one is large group research in which populations are located, assigned randomly to different conditions, and these really become separate universes, separate worlds that can be studied side by side, and the system becomes the level of analysis rather than the individual. And in these experiments, what we can do is assign half of these worlds to one condition and half of these worlds to another condition, and then we can look at system-level variance, and we can see what aspects of certain contexts lead a phenomenon to appear in those contexts, and in what situations it does not appear. And a good example of such a multi-context study is that is a study that was done recently by Damon Centola, in which individuals were randomly assigned to either a large world or a small world. In the large world was a ring lattice, and the small world was a random network in which all the ties had been rewired. And the derivation that Centola came up with was that, well, although viral contagions might spread easily in a small world, more easily than in a large world, because it's much easier to get from anywhere to anywhere in a small world, and in a large world it might get stuck somewhere locally and not spread any further. For social contagions, maybe this is the other way around. Why? Because if the local structure, the local clustering is broken up, then what happens is that if you need social reinforcement, and that we believe to often be needed for social contagions to spread, you need to hear something from multiple sources, not just from one source, in order to also join the crowd or adopt the behavior. Then breaking up that local structure will inhibit the spread of a behavior, and so we would have to see that in the smaller world, the spread of the behavior is less far and reaches fewer individuals than in the large world. And this is in fact what Centola found. And so this is an instance of where system-level variation can be explained through the derivation of theories from these theoretical assumptions. A second way by which this can happen is what I will call multi-context research. Now, we typically in sociology, where this is my home discipline, is that we have one study that analyzes only one system, and we're interested in explaining systems, and so this is really a problem. And now, for the first time, the information age in the last years has been able to produce so many different kinds of records, so detailed, of different kinds of behaviors, that it really becomes manageable now to look at many different systems at the same time and to classify these and say, well, this is context A and this is context B, and let's look if conditions under conditions X lead context A to exhibit the phenomenon and not context B. And so the contextual difference that in the past we would say, well, context matters, that now become variables in system-level analysis. So here is an overview of a lot of different degree distributions, topological properties that were compared across different data sets in a study by Closet, Shalizzi, and Newman. And they raised the question, how can you explain cross-context variation? It's an opportunity for the derivation of hypotheses with contextual variables as the predictors and the systems as the units of analysis. So rather than explaining behavior within any of the system, we're trying to explain behavior across systems. Here's a similar example already quite some years ago by Faust and Skvorets, who investigated and compared side by side different networks. And my favorite comparison is this comparison between the cows licking one another here and the US senators co-sponsoring one another. And the greater density here in the upper network really suggests that there's much more licking going on in the US Senate than among cows. So the conclusion is that the information age provides us with data that allows analysis at a system level. Not differences between individuals, but differences between social systems. And the third opportunity that there is for derivations is to provide predictions based on existing theories, or perhaps new theories, to explain how these systems systematically vary from one to the other. And so it allows us to not just stop with the observation context matters, but to say, yes, but how? And with that, I would like to conclude this lecture, and I would like to thank all the different mentors and collaborators that I've learned so much from over the years, and that have opened a lot of doors to me. And I think this is a great opportunity to just say once more, thank you very much.